Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 753 for February 3rd, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
Another reason why I drove this forward and bottled it when I did was that I know that where Glenmorangie leads, others follow, and there's many other people working in this field, but I believe we genuinely were the first to try this, so I wanted us to be the first to bottle it.
Just what is Glenmorangie's Dr. Bill Lumsden talking about? Well, without yeast to steer the fermentation process, we wouldn't have whiskey. But it is a bit more complicated than that. I was on hand when Bill Lumsden unveiled this year's private edition single malt the other night in London. Allta is completely different from not only the previous 9 private editions, but every other Glenmorangie for generations. That's because it was fermented with a strain of wild yeast from the distillery's nearby Cadboll Farm, and not the traditional distiller's yeast used all over the world. I'll discuss it with Bill Lumsden on WhiskyCast in depth. That's just ahead, along with my tasting notes for Allta in the What I'm Tasting This Week department, the calendar of events, and much more, including a homegrown method for peating barley long after it's left the maltsters. It's all coming up on this edition of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. Construction work on the revival of Scotland's Rosebank distillery should begin over the next few weeks, now that Falkirk Council has given its final planning permission for the project. The distillery has been closed since 1993, but Ian MacLeod Distillers was able to acquire the site from Scottish Canals and the rights to the Rosebank brand from Diageo. The footprint of the distillery will be adjusted somewhat to allow for a visitors center that was not part of the original Rosebank plan, but the stills will be built using original blueprints, and the whiskey will be triple distilled as it was back in the day. Ian MacLeod Distillers' managing director Leonard Russell was responsible for making the Rosebank revival happen in the first place. Or at least his family was.
Well, I drove past it and it looked sad, and I was with my son, and he said, "Oh, come on, Dad, let's walk round and have a look at it." And I was telling him how Rosebank has a great history, and he said, "Well, go on then, Dad, can't you do something here?" So I spoke to Diageo, who had the trademark, and also to Scottish Canals, who used to be the British Waterways Board, who owned the site, and miraculously we managed to do 2 deals to get the trademark and to get the site and put them back together, which was fantastic. It took a while to do, and it obviously takes a while to get planning permission because we need to do all sorts of surveys about water, transport, the availability of energy, etc. But it's all very happily come together.
What did your staff at Ian MacLeod say when you said, we're going to try to revive Rosebank?
Some of them said that I was a lunatic. But generally, the feeling, everyone I spoke to who knows and loves whiskey just thinks it's a fantastic plan. So the enthusiasm around it really made it an unstoppable process. And I'm glad that the process didn't stop and that we managed to see it through to fruition. Obviously, there's a lot to do, but we've already made plans of how it's going to be. So we've pressed all the start buttons now, and we're on our way to reviving it.
While it'll be years before whiskey from the new Rosebank is ready to be bottled, Russell also was able to acquire Diageo's stocks of old Rosebank single malt as part of the deal. It includes casks filled between 1989 and 1993. There will likely be at least 2 single cask bottlings released later this year, and a 30-year-old Rosebank is on the cards for 2023. Meanwhile, Diageo unveiled its plans for the revival of the Port Ellen Distillery on Islay to the community this week. The project is in the middle of a public comment period before the final planning application can be submitted to the Argyll and Butte Council. Diageo's proposal calls for the landmark kiln building and warehouses to be restored as part of the project, while a new still house will be built. It'll house the 2 main production stills designed to match the original Port Ellen design, while there will be a second, smaller set of stills that can be used for experiments with alternative spirit styles. We'll have more details on the project as they become available. In other news, U.S. Treasury Department employees in the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau finished up their first full week on the job since the partial government shutdown ended last weekend. The agency received just shy of 10,000 label approval applications between New Year's Day and last Monday, and the staff is working their way through the backlog stemming from the shutdown. As of this weekend, they're processing distilled spirits applications through January 18th with an average processing time of 36 days. And that's actually the best-case scenario so far. That's because beer and other malt beverages are still dated back to mid-December with a 53-day average processing time. Wine applications are on a 40-day average. Keep in mind that the current tentative budget deal between the Trump administration and Congress only provided funding through February 15th for the TTB and other federal agencies affected by the shutdown, and unless there is an extension or a permanent deal, the TTB could find itself shut down once again. Meanwhile, U.S. distillers are also being hurt by the impact of tariffs on exports of whiskey and other spirits to the European Union, Canada, China, Mexico, and other countries after last year's trade war over steel and aluminum. This week, the Agriculture Department awarded the Distilled Spirits Council $815,000 from a special fund set up to help agricultural groups affected by the tariffs. The money will be used to fund export promotion programs in key markets. Council executives have called on the Trump administration and its trading partners to resume talks aimed at ending the trade war. Heaven Hill has named a new master distiller. Connor O'Driscoll will be just the 5th master distiller in the company's history. He left Angel's Envy, where he was operations manager, to join Heaven Hill, and he previously oversaw operations at the Brown-Forman and Woodford Reserve distilleries. O'Driscoll replaces Denny Potter, who left Heaven Hill in September to return to Maker's Mark as master distiller and general manager. Meanwhile, one of the whiskeys O'Driscoll's former colleagues at Angel's Envy have been working on is about to be released. Until now, all of the Angel's Envy bourbons have been finished in port wine casks, but this new bourbon is finished in Oloroso sherry casks. It'll be available starting February 15th exclusively at the distillery in Louisville and a handful of Kentucky retailers for around $200 a bottle, while members of the distillery's 500 Main online affinity group can reserve bottles starting on the 12th to pick up in person on the 15th. Also in bourbon country, Jefferson's is releasing the new Journey bourbon. It's a variation on Jefferson's Ocean, which spends part of its maturation time on board ships at sea. In this case, though, the whiskey took a journey down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to the Gulf of Mexico, then around Florida and up the U.S. East Coast to New York. Trey Zeller wanted to recreate the historical journeys that helped make Kentucky bourbon famous more than a century ago.
So what I tried to do was replicate or reenact how bourbon was brought from Kentucky up to the East Coast when people were willing to pay much more for the whiskey coming out of Kentucky than they were elsewhere. And thus, bourbon distilleries started to populate Kentucky, where there were thousands of them in the early 1800s, to making bigger and bigger ones as some of them became more popular.
They only took 2 barrels down the river and back up, so it's being bottled in 200-milliliter bottles as a set with whiskey from the same batch that did not make the journey, so that you can taste the differences between the two. The sets are being sold at the Kentucky Artisan Distillery in Crestwood, Kentucky, and at select Kentucky retailers for $99 each. And there is a lot more to this story. We'll have more with Trey Zeller on the next episode of WhiskyCast. One more experiment to mention. Buffalo Trace has released its first experimental collection series bottlings for 2019. The 2 bourbons were aged more than 9 years in barrels made from oak staves seasoned for 3 and 4 years, respectively. Most bourbon barrels are made from staves allowed to season in the environment for 6 months to a year before being turned into barrels. The whiskeys will be sold separately in 375-milliliter bottles for a recommended retail price of around $46 each, and in limited quantities. Daft Mill Distillery's second release is on the way. It comes from casks filled in 2006. There will be versions available in the UK and in export markets. No word on pricing. And finally, Whiskey Magazine inducted 2 new members to its Hall of Fame this week during the presentation of its U.S. Icons of Whiskey Awards. The late Dave Pickerel was added to the Hall of Fame, along with Mike Miller, the owner of Delilah's Whiskey Bar in Chicago. Congratulations to Mike and to Dave's family. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. If you're not a member of the Highland Park Inner Circle, what are you waiting for? It's the fastest way to get details on exclusive Inner Circle releases, contests, and all the news from Orkney. Best of all, it's free. Sign up today and check out the entire lineup at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. First off, tickets for the more than 665 different events so far during May's Spirit of Speyside Festival will go on sale this Tuesday at noon GMT. They're available only through the festival's website at spiritofspeyside.com, and if past years are any guidance, many events will sell out almost immediately. The festival runs from May 1st through the 6th. Between now and then, Buffalo Trace will host its annual Buffalo Love Valentine's Dinner this Saturday night, February 9th, at the distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. Maker's Mark Distillery will also have special Valentine's dinners each night from the 14th through the 16th in Loretto, Kentucky. Distill America is on the 16th in Madison, Wisconsin, and the Vault Biennial is on the 16th and 17th in Mumbai, India. The Whiskey Exchange hosts a Michter's tasting on the 18th at its Fitzrovia store in London. The Uppsala Beer and Whiskey Festival is coming up on the 22nd and 23rd in Uppsala, Sweden. Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts has its annual Go Whiskey Weekend, the 22nd through the 24th. And a few tickets are still available for the Whiskey Show Old and Rare in Glasgow, Scotland, that same weekend. Whiskey and Barrel Night New York is on February 27th, and the Winnipeg Whiskey Festival is coming up March 1st and 2nd in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Right now, we have 226 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just use the search button to find one near you or wherever you'll be traveling during 2019.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. I was in London this week when Glenmorangie unveiled its 10th private edition release on Tuesday night. Allta is unlike any previous Glenmorangie single malt released in a very long time. That's because it's the result of an experiment Dr. Bill Lumsden and his team started working on years ago. There's a plot of farmland near the distillery called the Cadboll Farm, and all of the barley for Allta came from that farm. The thing is, the barley wasn't the only thing in Allta that came from that field. Most Scotch whiskey distillers rely on a common strain of yeast to ferment the mash that goes into their whiskies. It usually comes prepackaged in either dry or liquid form, and this so-called distiller's yeast provides a consistent result, which is exactly what distillers depend on. Glenmorangie has used distiller's yeast for years now, but Lumsden and his team worked with their yeast supplier to isolate and cultivate a unique strain of wild yeast found in the Cadboll field. That's the yeast that was used to make Allta, and as Bill Lumsden told me Tuesday night in London, it's definitely a change of pace from his past private edition releases.
It's the first time, or the second time actually, because if you go back to sale, but it's the first or second time we've actually bottled a product where we've relied more on differences in primary production rather than wood and cask management. And, you know, it's been a very, very long time coming, this project, because from the original idea to finding a partner, to isolating the strain, to culturing it up, blah, blah, blah. It takes such a long time to do that.
And you actually cultivated this yeast from the Cadboll field where the barley came from.
Absolutely, Mark, yeah. And, you know, I always felt that was my best opportunity to find wild yeast there. And, you know, I could have swabbed the roof, the mash tun, all these good things, but I felt that was my best bet to get some really healthy, thriving fungus was in the field. So that's where it came from, Mark. I always had faith in it. I knew it would give me something different. How different, I just didn't know. And if I'm 100% honest here, and this is, you know, between us girls, a little bit off the record, another reason why
Before you say a word, Bill, I'm sticking a microphone in your face. It's hard to be off the record when there's a mic in your face.
I'm being tongue-in-cheek here, Mark.
I'm just making sure.
Yeah. So, you know, another reason why I drove this forward and bottled it when I did was that I know that where Glenmorangie leads, others follow, and there's many, many other people working in this field, but I believe we genuinely were the first to try this, so I wanted us to be the first to bottle it, and that's why it's kind of 8.5 years old.
How hard was it to actually cultivate the yeast once you found it in the field?
It was not easy at all. We simply would not have had the capability in my own little laboratories to do that. You know, as a yeast technologist, I could have done it, but I don't have the facilities to do it. And that's why we partnered our friends from Lallemand here, who of course have their laboratories set up to isolate, typify and culture up different styles of yeast.
Explain what this yeast did when you fermented it in the mash compared to the standard Saccharomyces cerevisiae that you normally would use.
Yeah, okay. The standard yeast adjusts very well to typical conditions in a washback in the Scotch whisky industry. It grows very quickly, it ferments very powerfully, it gives you high spirit yields and most of the flavour congeners you're looking for. So it's tried and trusted, it's an old workhorse, everyone knows how it works. So with this new strain, honestly, Mark, we just didn't know what we were going to get. And the fact that it didn't ferment out as well was absolute music to my ears, because that basically told me we're going to find different flavours in here. And I wasn't hugely interested in the level of alcohol or whatever. Obviously, we monitored it, and it was not that much less, but it was less. But it was all about the different flavours we found in there.
You also chose to bottle this one at something closer to cask strength, 51.2 if I get it right. That's about the strongest you've bottled something in a long time, if I remember right.
It's the strongest we've bottled a Glenmorangie for a long time, apart from Astar, which we bottled at 52 point something or other. And it was partly because I wanted to offer the 10th anniversary edition with a bit more oomph about it. But it was primarily, again, because through trials and tasting, that was the strength at which we felt it most beautifully expressed the flavour difference. So it's as simple as that.
When you're experimenting, you've done a lot with wood, you've done a lot with maturation. This is the first time you've done something with yeast. What other venues do you have to play with now?
So this is the first experiment which has reached fruition in terms of in a bottle from all of my many fermentation experiments. So there's a lot more where that came from, Mark, I can assure you, and I'm still working on that. In terms of looking at barley varieties, malting and kilning, there's a lot of good stuff coming out of there. So, I can't give too much away here, but this, I believe, was a first in the Scotch whisky industry, certainly in recent terms, and I've got at least another 2 or 3 products which no one will even have dreamt of doing. One in particular, Mark, will be impossible for anyone else to do. And I'm talking more about wood here, so, lots more to come.
I remember a couple of years ago when you did Milshin, and the SWA coming in and saying, no, what you did with that one was not quite traditional practice. I don't think anybody can argue that using wild yeast and cultivating it is not traditional practice, but since distillers have been using distillers' yeast for years, could somebody come back and say, now using wild yeast isn't traditional practice anymore?
I think the reality here, Mark, is that as long as you can show that historically it's been used traditionally, then it's okay. And I don't think anyone can argue against the fact that back in the day, and I mentioned that, goodness knows what was being used to inoculate the fermentation. I honestly have this feeling that ears of raw barley would have been dipped in the washback, and I think I'm probably not wrong there, Mark, because again, they're so ridden with fungus and yeast and things. It's a natural way to do it, and our company archivist is currently working on that to see what he can find for me.
By the way, this was not just a one-time experiment. They've been making whiskey using that wild yeast 1 week a year for the last 8 years or so. There's no word on when we might see another release using that yeast. And before you ask, the question of whether they've done something similar at Ardbeg never came up on Tuesday night. Full disclosure, I was in London for the Allta debut as the guest of Glenmorangie, but full editorial control over the content of this segment remains with WhiskyCast. That's WhiskyCast in Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the new House Lannister Lagavulin 9-year-old. It's part of the Game of Thrones single malt Scotch whiskey collection from Diageo and HBO. You'll find it at a whiskey shop near you. And check out the rest of the Lagavulin single malts at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. And let's start off with the Glenmorangie Allta, the 10th annual release in Glenmorangie's Private Edition series, and the strongest of the lot so far at 51.2% ABV. The nose is malty and sweet with barley sugar, vanilla beans, and a hint of citrus. There's also a nice earthiness with sawdust and a touch of dry green grapes. The taste starts off dry and sherry-like, followed by a burst of white pepper, allspice, and ginger root that fades slowly to reveal citrus fruits, barley sugar, and a hint of honey, along with a slightly herbal touch in the background. Now that wild yeast comes out with a few drops of water, which adds a touch of rising bread dough and accentuates that hint of garden herbs. The finish is very long. There are touches of barley sugar, along with citrus fruits and a slight hint of lingering spices. I'm scoring the Glenmorangie Allta a 94. Now, we can compare that to the Glenmorangie Cadboll, which uses the traditional distiller's yeast and was released in the travel retail market last year. It's bottled at 43% ABV and was finished in sweet French wine casks. The nose is delicate, fruity, and floral, with hints of fresh berries, honey, tree fruits, vanilla, and a subtle flinty touch of dry sweet wine. The taste, thick and fruity with tree fruits, a hint of clove and other spices, and touches of honey and creme brulee. The finish is gentle and smooth with lingering spices, and I'm scoring the Glenmorangie Cadboll a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. 85 years ago, as the end of Prohibition meant a renewed demand for Kentucky bourbon, Ed Shapira and his brothers invested in a new distillery in Bardstown. They bought out their partners later on. Today, that little startup is the largest family-owned and operated distillery. Get the entire history at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Walsh Whiskey is releasing a new batch of Writer's Tears Cognac Cask Finish. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of ripe tree fruits, red grapes, hints of dried flowers, toffee, and soft spices. The taste is syrupy thick with a good burst of white pepper, tree fruits, a hint of raspberries, and red grapes with a nice balance. The finish is long and fruity with a subtle spiciness, and I'm scoring the Writer's Tears Cognac Cask Finish a 93. Let's wrap up with the new Basil Hayden's 10-year-old bourbon from Beam Suntory. This one is bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has classic bourbon notes of caramel, molasses, brown sugar, dark chocolate, and charred oak. However, the taste is not quite as classic. There's a lot of cherry cola in this one, with touches of black pepper, caramel, and molasses in the background. That cherry cola flavor lasts throughout the finish with just a touch of spice. And I'm scoring the Basil Hayden's 10-year-old bourbon an 85. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,500 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at WhiskyCast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
If you haven't done it already, I hope you'll take just a minute this week to post a review or leave a rating for WhiskyCast on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Those ratings may not seem like much, but they really do help influence the search results that will help other whiskey lovers discover the show when they're looking for podcasts. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. It's presented by Lot 40. Tom, at the Tracer Bullet on Twitter, asked this question from Maryland the other day. I was curious, are you a member of the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society? I've been thinking of joining, but it seems a lot of their special offers, at least the few I've seen, are UK SMWS bottlings only. I tried contacting them to inquire, but it was radio silence. I've waited about 5 years because of that. Well, Tom, for the record, I was gifted a membership many years ago by the U.S. chapter's previous owners, though I don't think I've ever actually bought a bottle to this date. They do offer whiskeys to U.S.-based members, but each national chapter around the world works just a bit differently, and generally the only way to find out what's available to you is to check with that local chapter. Last time around, we reported on the split between Walsh Whiskey and Italy's Ilva Serrano, which is keeping the Royal Oak Distillery in Ireland, while Walsh keeps its Writer's Tears and the Irishman brands. And Cathal, at Whiskey Fodder, tweeted this from Dublin. Anyone know what the story is with tours these days? Really wanted to visit Royal Oak, but it wouldn't be the same without the Irishman or Writer's Tears. Well, I've been able to confirm that the tours are still going on as usual at Royal Oak following the split, and even though the brands are owned by Walsh Whiskey, Royal Oak will still be pouring them for visitors. You have to keep in mind here that while the joint venture has been dissolved, the two companies still have business ties. Ilva Serrano is the importer for the Walsh brands in the U.S., Italy, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. So there does remain an incentive for them to work together. Crystal Coverdale at Edgy Lassie on Twitter tweeted this from British Columbia on our latest WhiskyCast HD video with 40 Creek Whiskey founder John Hall. Definitely worth a watch. Thanks, WhiskyCast. So good to hear from John and some of his Victoria Whiskey Festival 2019 speech. I'll be eager to see what canvas he paints next. Thanks, Crystal. And you can watch that story on our YouTube channel or at whiskycast.com. And finally, I posted some photos from this week's Glenmorangie Allta launch on social media this week. Lydia Calhooligan in Canada posted this note on our Facebook page. Would you say it has Allta good flavors? Well played, Lydia. Well played. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always track us down on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at WhiskyCast, and you can also email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other stuff that all make whiskey unique. It's presented by Writer's Tears. Most of the time, peated barley comes straight from a commercial malt producer who dries the barley with peat smoke at the end of the malting process. And frankly, most peated barley used by distilleries around the world comes from maltsters in Scotland. But what do you do when you want to use local peat and locally grown barley? That's the dilemma Graham McAloney of Victoria Caledonian Distillery in British Columbia faced. He and his team have started selling their 18-month-old unpeated single malt spirit, but he wanted to follow up on that with a peated version.
My roots originally 10 generations back, 7 greats grandfather was in Islay, and I know the exact farm that he stayed in and whatnot. So let's do an Islay style, right? Peated single malt whiskey, Canadian single malt whiskey. And the challenge there, of course, is it'd be really cool to do it with Canadian barley, local peat. So as a scientist engineer, I really took some time to think about how we're going to do this. If it's a floor malting, that's a lot of space. It's very manpower intensive, highly variable product coming out. And so I went back to Islay and visited with John Campbell, was very gracious, let me spend some time with his maltman. Anthony Wells at Kilhoman as well, and spent a lot of time there really looking at the equipment, the malting, traditional malting processes, the smoking processes, and then came back to Canada. Talked with the team, Mike Nicholson, master distiller, myself, the team, and my cousin's husband. He's a farmer out on the Canadian prairies, and some of the most practical individuals you'll ever come across. And so basically I gave those guys the concept for doing a soaker smoker, where we'll take existing malted barley, Canadian malted barley, so we'll get an extremely consistent, good quality malt, cut out that highly variable portion of the malting, and then we actually soak it and smoke it locally at the distillery using local peat. I don't know if it's going to be the first, but certainly one of the first Canadian single malt peated whiskies made with Canadian barley and smoked in Canada.
Macaloni expects to start selling that peated spirit in about 15 to 18 months. Of course, it'll have to be called whiskey spirit because Canada requires a minimum 3 years of maturation before it can be called whiskey. I'll taste it when it's ready. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can find links for our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD video stories, including our new one with 40 Creek Whiskey founder John Hall. We also have the latest whiskey news, events, photos, and much more at the website, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes, all the way back to 2005. Our cask strength conversation continues all week long online. Look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WhiskyCast. Or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.